On behalf of the faculty committee responsible for convocations at Ball State University, I'm happy to welcome you to the first convocation for the academic year 1965-1966. If you have not received a copy of the schedule for remaining convocations, they will be available as you leave the auditorium this evening. Tonight, our memories review and perhaps retrace 1,000 days. Days of youth, strength, aspirations, struggles, despair, triumph converted to tragedy, and then a statue carved in the hearts of the American people forever. It's a living retrospect which eloquently testifies that much has been given us, much will rightfully be expected from us, that we have duties to others and duties to ourselves, and we can shirk neither. Thomas Carlyle wrote that history is the biography, the acts, the ideas of great men, heroic acts and ideas imaginatively formulated and brilliantly expressed. President Kennedy possessed the depth and the breadth of knowledge and the felicity then to write and to speak with clearness and force. He possessed what John Quincy Adams called the arsenal and the artillery in the effective presentation of an idea. Ball State University warmly welcomes and is genuinely honored to present Theodore C. Sorensen, the man frequently referred to as President Kennedy's top policy aide, intellectual blood bank, alter ego, and chief of staff for ideas. History already records that Mr. Sorensen was the President's main confidant outside the Kennedy family. This, incidentally, will be Mr. Sorensen's first formal public address since the death of President Kennedy. He was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1928 and graduated from the University of Nebraska, Phi Beta Kappa, in 1949. He received his law degree from Nebraska 2 years later. In 1953, he became the administrative assistant to the newly elected senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, and was appointed special counsel to the President in November 1960. This, again, was the first appointment made by then President-designate Kennedy. His high regard for Mr. Sorensen is indicated, perhaps to a small degree, in the preface of Profiles in Courage, at which time President Kennedy wrote, "The greatest debt is owed to my research associate, Theodore C. Sorensen, for his invaluable assistance in the assembly and preparation of the material upon which this book is based." Mr. Sorensen recently completed his biography of President Kennedy, and in it I think he reveals in the prologue this central attachment to the President, to his program, to his ideas. And he writes this: "This is my substitute for the book he was going to write. It reflects to the extent possible his views during his last 11 years. It employs to the extent possible his words and his thoughts. It explains to the extent possible his reasons. I have no doubt that he would have written such a book. It has recently been suggested," he said during his first month in the White House, "that whether I serve 1 or 2 terms in the presidency, I will find myself at what might be called the awkward age, too old to begin a new career and too young to write my memoirs." But in several conversations, he made clear to me his intention to write his memoirs as soon as he left the White House, at least the story of his presidency, which might well have been only a first installment. It would have been a remarkable book. Few American presidents who made so much history possessed his sense of history, or his talent as a writer, or his willingness to be so candid. Far more than most politicians, he not only could objectively measure his own performance, but also cared deeply about how that performance would be measured by future historians as well as contemporary voters. His own recollections of public service would have made a memorable volume, carefully factual, amazingly frank, witty, and wise, and none of his biographers can hope to do as well. Mr. Sorensen reveals immediately his bias. This is not even a neutral account, he says. An impassioned participant cannot be an objective observer. Having formed a strong attachment for John Kennedy, I cannot now pretend an attitude of complete detachment. Having devoted nearly 11 years to advancing his interests and explaining his views, I cannot now cloak my partisanship as disinterested scholarship. This book, let it be clear at the outset, praises John Kennedy and what he has done, not merely out of loyalty and affection, but out of deep pride and conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to welcome Mr. Theodore C. Sorensen. Mr. Sorensen.
Thank you, Professor Diedrich, for that very generous introduction. I was afraid you were going to read so much of my book that no one would buy it. Members of the faculty, fellow students, those of you who were misled by the sign out in front into thinking that Bob Newhart was here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked in starting this round of lectures to make it clear that I no longer speak for the White House. I'm delighted to make that announcement, provided I can announce at the same time that the White House no longer speaks for me. I appreciated very much the nice words about my book which Professor Diedrich has spoken. As we were leaving the Student Center just now, Miss Kitchen, who is the head of the campus bookstore, came up to me and said she was delighted to meet someone, an author of one of the books in her stores. And I said I appreciated that, and she said, why? She said, I wish that I'd ordered 50 of your books from the publisher. I said, well, that's very, very nice of you, Miss Kitchen. How many did you order? She said, 200. I've been puzzling, as the good doctor can testify, over my topic for tonight. I had originally considered writing a lecture entitled Jackasses in Public Life as I Have Known Them. But unfortunately, every time I had it finished, another one came along, so... Since I didn't have time to write a full speech, I asked Arthur Schlesinger if he could write a few words for me. But he said he was busy doing something else. I don't know what, so I saw Arthur and a good many of my other former colleagues in New York last night. Quite a few of the sophisticated and urbane New Yorkers couldn't understand why I would be coming out to Muncie, Indiana. I said that one reason was that I wanted to get a drink of water, and the other was I wanted to read a newspaper. The other reason is that I would like to say a few words tonight before throwing it open to questions about President Kennedy, about his legacy for America, I will admit at the outset of this speech, as I did in the outset of the book in the quotation which Professor Diedrich read, that I have a bias, so that I suppose the anti-Kennedy element in the audience, if there is one, won't like this speech any better than they like the one which he delivered on this campus in April of 1960, and I had something to do with both speeches, so I know what their effect was. I suppose it might be asked, how could I choose as a title the legacy of John Kennedy? There is an assumption all too commonly made that his term was too short, that his death was too sudden, that his accomplishments were too few to give us any lasting legacy. There is another body of opinion which says that what Kennedy had to offer really was only a matter of style, the rhetoric and the grace and the interest in the arts, the kind of man he was instead of the kind of program he stood for. And there is certainly a danger today, because of the tragic nature of his death, that what will remain as the Kennedy legacy is largely a matter of myth and legend and the kind of supernatural fiction which grows up about martyred heroes. I disagree with all of those conclusions. But I am frank to say that, in part, how much of a Kennedy legacy there is depends on you and me and all of us. It depends in part on circumstances beyond our control, on decisions made in Washington and Moscow and Peking, which could undo much of the work which John Kennedy did. But I think with all of those hazards, with all of the limitations imposed by the all too brief time he served, the legacy of Kennedy is a rich and lasting legacy. First of all, there's a legacy for American politics. I don't think that politics in this country will ever be the same. There was, first of all, his approach to the campaign itself, the campaign which he brought to this campus. More than any previous candidate, he used all the modern techniques. He used public opinion polls as they had never been used before, not because he intended to adhere slavishly to the whims and turns of public opinion, but because he recognized these as new scientific tools to help him study areas with which he was unfamiliar. He used air travel and advanced men, and above all, television, as they had never been used before. The TV debates between presidential candidates were not held in 1964, which I understand, because I think the problems confronting an incumbent president are different. But I think that kind of debate, which was imitated in many state races in 62 and 64, has once again returned as an entrenched part of American political life. His speeches, if I may say so, were literate, of a high quality. He drew upon academic talent across the country for new ideas, for the best in American thinking. And it will be difficult for future candidates to go back to the more pedestrian approaches of the past. His campaign pace was one of all-out effort from the very beginning, of running just as hard for the presidency from the opening gun until the finish line as a man possibly could, entering all the primaries, including the primary here in Indiana, touring all the state conventions, trying to pick up every possible delegate vote in the national convention, and carrying on that same pace immediately after the convention, disregarding all the rules about timing and pacing and building to a peak. Many of these campaign techniques have now been copied in other countries. And this is one of many areas where the Kennedy legacy is not only an American legacy. The German campaign, only recently completed, showed examples on both sides of candidates following the Kennedy approach. He had other profound changes on the politics of this country. The men whom he brought into government, the young people whom he attracted into politics and public service, will be around for a long time, shaping issues, influencing decisions in our public affairs. Their loyalty was not to Kennedy alone, but to the ideals which he represented. And those loyalties will continue for many years. He said that he wanted a ministry of talent in Washington, men who had no other dedication or obligation than the national interest. And I believe to a remarkable degree he succeeded in bringing those kind of men to Washington. But it's not only cabinet officers and sub-cabinet officers and agency heads that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the thousands of young men and women who entered the Peace Corps, who will go from that into the Foreign Service or into teaching or into other government posts or into politics back in their hometowns. I'm talking about thousands of young men and women who entered party politics in their own area, some of whom were inspired to get into politics wholly apart from the party of President Kennedy because of the example he set, because of the interest he stirred. That is an effect on American political life which cannot be taken away. And finally, the Kennedy legacy on politics, which I think is as important as any he contributed to this country, was his shattering of the religious barrier for national office. That barrier was not shattered by his election alone. Shortly after that day in November, when he knew the office was his, the President said to me, after all our worries about the religious issue over the years, that the election alone had not ended it. It had suspended it. It had proven that a Catholic could be elected president. But the real test, he said, would be his administration. If in that administration he confirmed the fears of those alleging that a Catholic would sell out the interests of the United States to the interests of his church, if he failed to maintain the wall of separation between church and state, then no Catholic would ever be nominated, much less elected again. But Kennedy did not confirm those fears. In his fight for public education, in his advances on population control, in his positions on censorship and a dozen other issues, he showed that he represented his own conscience and the national interest. And as a result, the religious issue is more dormant in this country today than it has ever been. The second area in which the Kennedy legacy is important was his effect on the presidency itself. If I were to select one area in which I thought his approach differed the most from his predecessor, I would select not some issue of domestic or foreign policy, but their attitudes toward the presidential office, their concept of its powers, and their exercise of those powers. This was partly an outgrowth of Kennedy the man. He had too much energy, too much natural curiosity, too much initiative as a human being to accept a concept of the president as a final arbiter to whom plans are submitted by contending factions within the government for a yes or a no. He was too interested in the affairs of his country and state, and too wrapped up in the campaigning which he had carried on for so long to consider his office to be above politics and partisan contention. He was too deeply committed to the plans which he put forward to look upon the legislative branch as an area in which he should not tread. Instead, he believed in the presidency, as he said so often in his election campaign, as the vital center of action, as the place to get things done. That's why he ran for the presidency. That's what he did when he became president. No bill was sent to the Congress without his consent from any of the executive departments. And no major bill was passed by the Congress which did not meet his approval. He involved himself in the Democratic Party politics at the state and local level in 61, 62, and on his final trip to Texas in 1963. He learned after the tragic errors at the Bay of Pigs early in his term not to permit the federal bureaucracy to run with the ball, not to permit schemes to be formulated at a lower level without his retaining complete control and without his being able to recognize when he had passed the point of being unable to call off a project. More than that, he made the presidency a force in our everyday private lives. He concerned himself not only with public issues, but private excellence. He was concerned about our physical fitness, about our appreciation of the arts, about school dropouts, about 1,001 other concerns which, according to the Constitution or the statutes of the United States, had nothing specifically to do with the office of the presidency. John Kennedy was determined that the president would dominate the White House, that the White House would dominate the executive branch, that the executive branch would lead the federal government, that the federal government would not have its will altered by individual states, and that the United States would meet its obligations of leadership in the world community of nations. To do this, he favored not an institutionalized presidency with an over-formalized organization of the cabinet and the National Security Council and the interagency committees which had proliferated in such numbers before he took office. He achieved this goal instead through a personalized presidency, by making the maximum use of his White House staff as additional eyes and ears and arms and tongues throughout the executive branch, by making sure that he followed each decision himself from the ground up, by demonstrating in his press conferences and in his television appearances that he was the best informed man in Washington, and that he was therefore able to keep the American people informed. And I think this concept of the presidency as the vital center of American life is a concept which will endure among future presidents. Third, John Kennedy left a legacy of importance on the American economy. He recognized that fiscal policy was a tool of economic policy, that the budget was not simply a set of books to be balanced by an accountant, but a weapon to be used to combat recession, unemployment, and inflation. He recognized that budget deficits could be a good as well as an evil. In all the previous history of this country, a tax cut had been regarded as a step to be taken when there was a surplus in the budget, or when a depression was threatening, or when expenditures were being cut by a like amount. But the Kennedy tax cut of 1963 came at a time when not one of those three conditions was present or predicted, but was presented instead as a stimulus to growth and as a creator of jobs in the American economy. He also demonstrated what many Americans in modern time had regarded as hopeless, namely that recessions were not inevitable. Even many of our professional economists had come to think that this was a matter of an unavoidable cycle, that every few years the American economy would have to turn down, and men would have to be thrown out of work, and factories would have to stand idle. But there was a recession due in 1962-63, and that recession was skipped. And we haven't had one since. I don't say that all recessions in this country are over. I do say that an important part of the Kennedy legacy is a demonstration that the American economy can continue to grow. The opposite side of that coin was that inflation, Kennedy proved, was not inevitable either. Many economists, including those who disagreed sharply with him on his economic policies, assumed that inflation was a necessary companion of growth. Presidents in the past were accustomed to talking against inflation, but not against specific price rises. And President Kennedy, not only by his action in the steel price crisis, but by the formulation of wage price guidelines, indicated that here too the federal government had a role to play in preventing this robber of the weak. A fourth part of the Kennedy legacy is what I would call his effect on the American ideal. The ideal of equality and opportunity and the dignity of man, which has been with us since the founding of this country, in theory, if not always in practice. John Kennedy broke the official silence in Washington on the problem of race relations. And once it was broken for all time. The judicial branch, to be sure, had already spoken out courageously. Some token moves had been made previously in the legislative branch. But Kennedy mobilized the full powers of the executive branch through executive orders, through legislation, legislative proposals, through conciliation and negotiation moves with local groups and communities, through a whole series of actions that had not been taken before, and which were in a sense codified in the most comprehensive civil rights legislation that had ever been submitted to the American Congress, which he submitted in 1963. In effect, he placed himself at the head of that moral revolution, which was taking place in this country, and helped to guide it into more constructive channels. But Kennedy's concern for the American ideal was not a concern only for those of a different color or those of a different religion. One of his favorite phrases in talking about the civil rights problem was that everyone ought to be given a fair chance. Everyone isn't equal, he said. People have different talents, different abilities, different capacities, but they all ought to be given a fair chance to develop those capacities. And he applied that principle not only to the Negro, but to the undereducated and the underemployed and the poorly trained and the underprivileged and the retarded and the sick. His whole legislative program in the first few years on education, health, minimum wages, and depressed areas, job retraining, was aimed at opening those opportunities to all American people. Some of those legislative acts were innovations. Some of them were merely bringing up to date legislation which had been passed in earlier times. The whole Kennedy legislative program is thus a part of a legacy which is with us, a program greater and is realized by those who emphasize only the defeats which he suffered in the Congress and forget that his total accomplishments were greater than any legislative period since the early 1930s. Many of his most important bills, including the tax cut and the Civil Rights Bill, were not signed until 1964. And without question, their passage was helped by the brilliant legislative tactics of his successor, President Johnson. But the fact remains that it was Kennedy's program. And the legislative leaders of both parties, both Republican and Democratic, in both houses, both the House and the Senate, said at the close of the 1964 session that Kennedy would have passed this program. He had presented it, he had worked for it, he had taken it over its most difficult hurdles, and as he had recognized in his last press conference in 1963, it was a program which would require 2 sessions of Congress rather than 1. The final, and I think the most important area of Kennedy's legacy to the American people was his effect on our foreign policy. He had an effect on our attitude and actions within the developing nations, on putting our foreign aid on a more sensible, long-term basis, on initiating in Latin America an alliance for progress which, despite the fact that it faces tremendous obstacles, represents more effort toward those less privileged neighbors than had been shown them in at least a generation. And he sent to these countries that representative of American idealism and know-how, the Peace Corps, which will be known in many countries for a long time, as it is today, as Kennedy's children. With respect to our alliance in Western Europe, he forged in the Trade Expansion Bill of 1962 an unprecedented weapon for economic cooperation across the Atlantic. A bill which spelled the end of protectionism and economic isolation in this country, and which opened the way to the dream of Atlantic partnership, which he pressed throughout his term. A partnership which did not exclude the rest of the world, but looked outward instead of in, seeking to help other countries and to extend the hand of friendship to other parts of the world. With respect to American-Soviet relations, his accomplishments were perhaps the most profound of all. First, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he demonstrated to the Soviets and to the world that the prospects of nuclear war are suicidal, that Soviet hopes of obtaining further dominion through aggression or missile diplomacy and missile blackmail were futile, and that effective accommodation would be possible. And this led in time to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first step toward disarmament in the nuclear age. It led to the first American sale of wheat to the Soviet Union, to the hotline between Moscow and Washington to provide an emergency communications link in case of emergency, to an agreed upon ban of mass weapons from outer space, to the bare beginnings of an agreement between the American and Soviet space programs, to a whole new atmosphere of contacts and accommodation and détente between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was in this atmosphere that he had hopes for a united Europe, not merely a united Western Europe, but united Europe East and West, in which Germany would once again be one nation without a wall, and in which the original boundaries of Europe would once again be recognized. These were hopes, but in a very real sense, all of these Kennedy legacies are legacies of hope. He showed us that politicians do not have to be mediocre, that recessions are not inevitable, that progress can be made on the most difficult problems of race relations, and that effective and enforceable agreements are possible with our communist adversaries. And it is that hope that must be kept alive today, and that you and I have a responsibility to maintain and preserve and nourish, so that generations from now, history and posterity will say that the years of Kennedy were the years when the tide was turned. Thank you.